This is Dr.RED Panda.
What if I told you that some of the most powerful families in human history actively encouraged their children to marry their own siblings? It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a scandal. It was performed under the gaze of the entire world and regarded as the most sacred of rituals. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs took their own sisters as queens. In Europe, a dynasty that ruled half the continent walked step by step toward its own collapse, all because of this choice. Charles II of Spain. From the moment he was born, he was destined for a life of struggle. He could barely speak, struggled to move, and was ultimately unable to leave behind an heir. And this wasn't an accident. It was the calculated result of maintaining a pure bloodline. So here is the question. Why was an act that we view today as a near-universal taboo once considered an unshakable truth? And more importantly, are we certain that humans 1,000 years from now, looking back at us, won't feel that same sense of bewilderment? I am Dr. Red Panda. Join me as we explore a chapter of history that was once perfectly reasonable. Gods don't marry outsiders. If you were a young king, you'd expect your first challenge to be war, or betrayal, or someone trying to take your throne. But in ancient Egypt, your first duty could be something far stranger. Marry your own sister. Not hidden, not whispered about, not something people tried to justify after the fact. It was planned, celebrated, and carried out in front of the entire kingdom. Because in that world, this wasn't wrong. It was necessary. Tutankhamun became king at around 9 years old. A child, placed on a throne, expected to carry something far heavier than power. Because he wasn't just seen as a ruler. He was seen as a living god. And that changes everything. Because if a king is a god, then his blood isn't just symbolic. It becomes sacred, untouchable. And the moment that blood mixes with someone outside, you create a problem no army can solve. What happens if a god has a child with someone who isn't divine? Is that child still a god, or something less? That uncertainty alone was dangerous, because power at its core depends on one thing: people believing it makes sense. So the system found a solution, a brutally simple one. Keep the bloodline inside the family. No outsiders, no dilution, no questions. This wasn't something Tutankhamun invented. His father, Akhenaten, had already set the pattern. Most historians believe Tutankhamun's mother was actually Akhenaten's own sister, which means this young king was born into a system that had already made the decision for him. He wasn't just inheriting power. He was inheriting a structure. And when it became his turn, he didn't break it. He continued it. His wife, Ankhesenamun, was not a foreign princess sent to build alliances. She didn't come from another kingdom. She came from the same bloodline, very likely his sister or half-sister. From a modern perspective, this feels shocking, uncomfortable, almost impossible to understand. But inside that world, this wasn't seen as a risk. It was seen as protection, because the alternative felt worse. If you married outside the family, power could spread. Claims to the throne could multiply. The idea that the king was divine could start to crack. And once that idea cracks, everything else follows. So the real question wasn't, why would they do this? It was, what would happen if they didn't? But over time, something began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. When scientists examined Tutankhamun's remains, they found a body that told a different story. Severe bone deformities, a foot condition that likely made walking painful, a fragile physical state that didn't match the image of a god. And inside his tomb, they found something even more unsettling. 2 tiny coffins, 2 stillborn daughters. No one at the time could explain it. There was no concept of genetics, no understanding of inherited risk. There were only patterns, repeating themselves. A bloodline meant to be perfect was becoming weaker. And yet, nothing changed. Because when an entire system, your power, your identity, your right to rule, is built on a single belief, you don't question it. You protect it, even when the cost starts to show. So they continued. They repeated the same choices. They held the line, not because they were blind, but because stepping outside that system meant stepping into uncertainty. And uncertainty is something power rarely tolerates. That's where the danger begins. Because when a system both explains the world and keeps you in control of it, you stop asking whether it's true. You only ask whether it still holds. And by the time it doesn't, it's usually too late. They tried to control everything, so they married themselves. If ancient Egypt made this feel sacred, Europe made it feel strategic. At least that's what they told themselves. Because here, no one said, "We're gods." They said something much more believable: "We're protecting power." And at first, it looked smart. Marry into another royal family, you gain land. Marry the right person, you avoid war. Marry well enough, you can control half of Europe without picking up a sword. But then something started bothering them. Every time you married out, you gave something away: a claim, connection, a piece of control that no longer belonged only to you. So someone at some point had a very simple idea. What if we just stop letting outsiders in? And that's when things got weird. Not immediately, but slowly, then all at once. Because once you decide that power must stay pure, your options shrink fast. You marry your cousin. That's normal. But then your cousin's daughter becomes the perfect match. Then your sister's child starts looking politically convenient. And before long, you're not expanding your family anymore. You're recycling it. No one represents this better than Charles II of Spain. His story doesn't start with him. It starts generations before, with a family that kept choosing control over everything else. Charles II's parents, an uncle and his niece. In this family, that was just another marriage, because it had already happened before, repeatedly. If you trace his lineage, you start seeing the same names again and again. One ancestor shows up twice, then 4 times, then 8. At some point, his family tree stops branching. It starts collapsing inward. Imagine a mirror facing another mirror, reflecting the same image endlessly. That's his bloodline. And then Charles is born into it. From the beginning, something is off. His jaw is so pronounced that he can't properly close his mouth. Eating is difficult. Speaking is slow. His body is weak, he gets sick constantly. Walking is a struggle. Some accounts say he needed help just to stand. And yet, this is the man expected to rule an empire. But the real problem comes later. Everything his family tried to protect comes down to one thing: an heir. And Charles II can't produce one. Think about the scale of that failure. Generations of calculated marriages. Decades of keeping power pure. All leading to one person who can't continue the line. It doesn't just weaken the dynasty. It ends it. When he dies in 1700, there is no clear successor. Suddenly, every royal family in Europe has a reason to step in. What follows is chaos. A massive war breaks out over who gets to take what's left. So the thing they were trying to avoid, conflict, instability, loss of control, happens anyway. Just delayed. And much worse. And here's the unsettling part. They saw it happening. This wasn't hidden. They could see the physical traits. They could see the weakness. And still, they didn't stop. Because stopping meant admitting something unthinkable. That the very thing protecting their power was destroying it. So instead, they did what humans always do when a system starts breaking: they doubled down. Closer marriages. Tighter circles. More control. Until control was the only thing left. And by then, there was nothing left to control. If you were there, you wouldn't say no. By now, it's easy to say, they were insane. They were wrong. They should have known better. But that's the most comfortable lie in this entire story. Because they didn't feel insane. They felt correct. Think about it. If you were born into the world of Tutankhamun, you wouldn't grow up questioning the system. You would grow up inside it. Every priest, every advisor, every tradition, all telling you the same thing: your blood is not ordinary. Your role is not optional. Your choices are not yours. And if you were born into the world of Charles II of Spain, it gets even worse. Because now it's not about gods. It's about survival. Imagine this, you're next in line to rule. And someone tells you, if you marry outside the family, you risk losing everything. Your land, your title, your legitimacy, your right to exist at the top. But if you marry inside, everything stays stable, predictable, controlled. So let me ask you something honestly, what would you choose? Not what sounds moral, not what sounds modern. What would you choose if the cost of doing the right thing was losing everything your family had built for generations? Because that's the part we avoid. We like to believe we would be different, smarter, more ethical, more independent. But history has a pattern, and it's not subtle. People don't usually choose what's right. They choose what feels necessary. And necessity can justify almost anything. That's how something disturbing becomes normal. That's how something dangerous becomes tradition. That's how something obviously broken keeps going for centuries, until it collapses. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this story isn't really about them. It's about us. Every generation believes they've finally figured it out, that their values are more advanced, more rational, more complete. And yet, every generation before us believed the exact same thing. So here's the question no one likes to sit with. What are we doing right now? That feels completely normal, completely justified, completely unquestionable, that people in the future will look at and say, how did they not see it? And don't answer too quickly, because the people in this story had answers too. They had reasons. They had logic. They had entire systems built to explain why everything they were doing made perfect sense. Just like we do. So I want you to really think about this not as history, not as something distant, but as a choice. If you were born into that world, with everything on the line, would you have done the same thing? Or do you just like to believe you wouldn't? Be honest. Drop it in the comments. Because this isn't just a question about the past. It's a question about how much you actually trust your own judgment when it really matters. And that's a wrap for this episode of the video. I'm Dr. Panda. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, take care.